A partitioned survival model is one of the easiest ways to evaluate the cost effectiveness of oncology treatments. It's super simple to set up, and today I'm going to show you how you can build one from scratch in Excel. Once we're done, you'll know how to set up a PSM like this one that allows you to derive health state membership based on your survival curves, giving you the flexibility to select different distributions for long-term extrapolations. All we need to get started are two time-to-event datasets. One for progression-free survival and one for overall survival. PFS and OS are the key outcomes of any oncology trial, and we health economists often get results that look something like this. One column for time and one column for events. In this example, time is recorded in months with a follow-up of 2 years, while events are coded as 1 and censored observations are coded as 0. For PFS, an event means that a patient progresses, while an OS event indicates death. These PFS and OS time-to-event dataset can also be plotted as survival curves, which is what you'd commonly see reported in a clinical study report. Using our two curves, we want to build a model that captures 3 health states. One for patients who are progression-free, one for patients who are progressed, and one for patients who died. We know the proportion of patients who are progression-free from our PFS curve. Additionally, we can derive the proportion of progressed patients by subtracting the PFS curve from our OS curve. Lastly, we can derive the proportion of patients who died as 1 minus our OS curve. That's why at all times we can inform health state membership in our PSM using only 2 curves. Our dataset only covers 2 years though, which isn't enough to model outcomes over a lifetime horizon. That's why we need to fit so-called parametric survival models to our time-to-event data to generate survival extrapolation parameters. Excel isn't the best tool to fit parametric survival models, but luckily it's super easy and simple to do in statistical software. I've already demonstrated how you can do this in R using the exact datasets I'm using today to build our PSM. If you'd like to learn how I generated these survival parameters, then check out the video that is linked in the top right corner. Today, we'll be using those inputs to build our partitioned survival model. As you can see, I already have 3 sheets in my Excel file. One for the time-to-event data, one where I transformed the time-to-event data to survival probabilities, and one for the survival extrapolation parameters. All the values in these sheets are hard-coded and act as the foundation of our partitioned survival model. Now that we have the foundation for our PSM in place, the first thing we want to do is get started building our model engine. In our simple example, we can break the PSM engine down into 3 main components, including time, PFS, and OS. Let's start by adding the elements we need to reflect time in our partitioned survival model. First off, I'm adding a column to reflect the cycle we're in. Since our time-to-event data is already expressed in months, it makes sense to use a monthly cycle length. We start out in cycle 0 and then add enough cycles to reflect a lifetime time horizon. I'm going all the way up to 600 cycles, or 50 years. How many cycles you need depends on your patient's baseline age. In this case, I'm assuming that on average, patients were 60 years old when they entered our clinical trial, so I'm adding another 50 years on top of that, which should be more than enough to reflect a lifetime time horizon. To be more accurate with how we calculate costs and QALYs, health economists like to use something called half-cycle correction. This assumes that patients transition between health state partway through a cycle rather than exactly at the start or at the end of a cycle. To implement this, we need to keep track of the time that passes in each cycle. In particular, we're tracking the time at the start of the cycle and at the end of the cycle, so that we can calculate the midpoint between those 2 time points. I'm calling these columns from, to, and mid. No time passes in our cycle 0, so all these 3 columns are 0. Cycle 1 starts at 0 and ends after 1 month, so roughly 30 or 31 days. To be more accurate about the number of days, let's create a helper input on a new sheet, which I'm calling inputs. Accounting for leap years, we know that there are 365.25 days in a year, so we can divide that by 12 to get the days per month. Back on the engine sheet, we now know that cycle 1 ends after 30.4375 days. With the beginning and end days, we can now calculate the midpoint using the average function in Excel. Moving on to cycle 2, we know that it starts where cycle 1 ends, so at 30.4375 days. Using this logic, we can simply write a formula that refers to the end date of the previous cycle to get the start time for the current cycle. In line with that, we can use a formula which takes the start time of the current cycle plus our days per month input and apply that logic to all other cycles. Lastly, you can see me add a column for the month, which I'm calculating as the midpoint divided by the number of days per month. By applying this approach, we can see that 11.5 months have passed in cycle 12, rather than the full year, as we are counting for half-cycle correction. Next, we want to keep track of our patient's age. As mentioned before, I'm assuming that our patients are 60 years on average at baseline. So let's make sure we capture that in our input sheet so that we can refer back to it and make changes later. I'm using this formula here to calculate age in each cycle, using the baseline reference input plus our cycle midpoint divided by the days per year. To see if this has worked, we can scroll all the way down to cycle 600, where our patients should be just under 110 years old. Another time factor worth tracking in a partitioned survival model is the background mortality. This is important as our survival extrapolation may predict unrealistically high long-term survival, which would contradict general population mortality rates. Using background mortality basically acts as a cap, ensuring that predicted survival doesn't exceed general population mortality. To incorporate background mortality into RCEM, we need life tables for men and women for the country of interest. Let's assume we're building a model for NICE, so we can take the life tables for England and Wales published by the ONS. What we want from this dataset is the QX variable, which represents the mortality rate between age X and X plus 1. In other words, this is the probability that a person aged X exactly will die before reaching age X plus 1. Let's get the latest QX data from men and for women and copy that over into our Excel file on a new sheet which we are calling life tables. You can see that the ONS data ends at year 100, so let's add a few more years beyond that where we set the mortality rates to 1, just to make sure that we've got enough data in our life tables to look up in our model engine. This ensures that after 100 years, everyone in our model should be dead, which is not perfectly reflective of the real world, but good enough for our case. Since mortality rates for men and women differ, we need to make an assumption about the proportion of females we have in our model. I'm assuming that our drug treats a cancer that is more prevalent in men, so I'm going to set the percentage female to 37%. Back on the life tables sheet, we can now calculate a weighted average mortality rate using this formula that adjusts for the percent females we have in our model. Now that we have accounted for gender-specific mortality differences, we're still left with another problem. The ONS life tables provide annual mortality rates, but our partitioned survival model uses a monthly cycle. That's why we need to do a conversion from annual to monthly mortality rates. We achieve that by using a force of mortality approach. I'll spare you the math behind this approach, just know that we're using our days per month and the days per year inputs in this formula to get what we need. From here, we can jump back to our engine sheet, where we can do an index lookup based on our cycle age to pull in the appropriate background mortality rates. Moving on, let's tackle discounting. In health economics, it is quite standard to apply a discount rate to both outcomes and costs to reflect that future costs and benefits are worth less than present ones. You could split this out into a column for cost and benefits if you wanted to apply separate rates, but I'm going to be lazy and do this in one column, just assuming that the discount rate for cost and benefit is the same. On our input sheet, we can set the value of our discount rate. I'm using 3.5% for both cost and outcomes, in line with the current NICE base case assumption. We can then use our newly defined input in a formula like this to derive the appropriate discount rate per cycle. This gives us a multiplication factor that decreases with time, which we can use later to discount our costs and benefits. Another common variable health economists like to explore is the time horizon and how it impacts results. To make sure that our model can accommodate a flexible time horizon, let's add a helper column for that to our engine. We can achieve that by having our formula return 1 whenever the respective cycle is within our selective time horizon, and if not, it will return NA. Let's say we wanted our minimum time horizon users can select to be 5 years and our maximum time horizon to be 50 years. Considering that our patient baseline age is 60 years, that should be more than enough. Moving over to our input sheet, we can define those two parameters. Note how it doesn't matter whether we set these parameters up as month or years, we just need to account for it appropriately in our formula. To demonstrate this, I'm setting up our minimum time horizon in month while using the years for our maximum time horizon. Back on the engine sheet, I can now use an if statement to check if our cycle month is smaller than our minimum time horizon, which we defined in months. I can then combine this with another if statement that uses the number of days at the end of each cycle divided by the days per year and check if that number is smaller than our maximum time horizon. To test if this has worked, let's set our maximum time horizon to 10 years. This should result in a formula returning NA starting in cycle 120, so after 10 years, which is the case for us. With all our time variables done, we can now move on to model PFS. First off, we want a column in which we pull in the survival percentages from our Kaplan-Meier data. We already have our KM data in our model, but the time points for our survival estimates don't necessarily align with our monthly cycles. We also want to make sure that this is dependent on our time horizon switch that we've built earlier. To satisfy these two conditions, we're using an if statement combined with the aggregate and index function. The aggregate function returns the maximum time point from our KM data, while the index function returns the corresponding survival percentage. Once the current cycle time exceeds the maximum KM time point, this formula returns NA, and by multiplying with our time horizon factor, we also make sure to respect those cutoffs. Since our minimum time horizon is longer than our KM data, this isn't strictly necessary, but may become relevant for you if you're using KM data that covers a longer time period. As we can see, our formula returns NA starting in cycle 25, which is what we'd expect given that we have 2-year Kaplan-Meier data. After all this setup, we're finally ready to focus on the crux of our partitioned survival model, which is the application of our parametric survival models to our KM data. We want to be able to easily switch between different survival models, so let's start by adding a drop-down menu to our inputs sheet for the survival model we're using, and we want to do that for both PFS and OS. In a previous video, we already fitted 7 parametric survival models to our data. This means that we've got 7 distributions to choose from, including exponential, gamma, generalized gamma, Gompertz, log-logistic, log-normal, and Weibull. To create the dropdown, we can use the list option from the data validation rules and create the selection menu for our survival distributions. We can now refer back to this list in our engine for ease of use. Since every survival model comes with different survival parameters, we want to make sure that we pull in the right parameters for each distribution. We achieve that by using a dynamic lookup using the index and filter function in Excel that pulls in the correct parameter name and value from the survival parameters sheet. With this in place, we're ready to estimate our parametric survival. To model parametric survival in Excel, we need a formula that looks something like this. I'm not going to go into detail on how this works exactly, just know that the basic idea is to let the survival model based on the input in K4 so that the appropriate survival function can be applied. As you can see, there are 7 lines in this formula to reflect the 7 distributions that we're modeling. We're also using the half-cycle corrected time horizon in months and our time horizon switch, which makes sure that the parametric survival switches to NA if the time horizon is exceeded. For example, if we set our time horizon to 10 years, parametric survival cuts off after 120 cycles. To check if this has worked, you can also compare your estimated parametric survival to your Kaplan-Meier data in the first 2 years. While these values won't exactly match, they should at least be somewhat similar to your KM data, assuming that your survival models fit reasonably well. After all, you're trying to mimic the shape of your KM data with your parametric extrapolation. Honestly, it is Excel formulas like these that can become very unhandy and difficult to review, which is why many people are now advocating for building partitioned survival models and other models in software like R, for example. Excel wasn't really designed to do a lot of these things, but yet it remains the main workhorse of economic modeling. Next up, we're going to calculate the parametric hazard rate using our extrapolated parametric survival, which represents the instantaneous risk of those who enter the cycle. We can calculate this as 1 minus the survival in cycle t+1 divided by the survival in cycle t. In other words, this formula answers the question, what percentage of those patients still alive at the beginning of our cycle will die during the cycle? We'll be using this parametric hazard rate in a bit when we're calculating our background mortality adjusted parametric PFS. Before we do that though, I'm going to add 3 more columns, one for PFS in use and one for each for our background mortality adjusted KM data and parametric survival. The PFS in use column is what will inform our health state occupancy later, and it is where we seek the minimum value of our competing risks. You see, a patient experiences multiple types of events, including disease progression, death from any cause, and death due to background mortality. This creates a realistic composite survival probability that accounts for disease progression, overall mortality, and background mortality adjustment simultaneously. For the PFS background mortality correction, we can refer back to the background mortality rate we've calculated earlier using a formula like this and initiating with a 100% survival in cycle 0. For the parametric PFS background mortality correction, we take a similar approach, only this time we take the maximum of the background mortality rate and the parametric hazard rate. Apart from the inputs in column U, where we'll later add the OS and use data, we now got all the inputs to calculate our PFS in use. The reference to column U is really just there to ensure that our PFS in use doesn't exceed our OS in use, which wouldn't be plausible. At this stage, all that's left to do is to repeat the process for OS so that we can derive the OS in use column that I've mentioned before. I'm going to speed this up so you can practice on the OS implementation yourself, but rest assured that you can also download the complete model from the video description if that's what you want to do. Okay, now that we've got everything we need for OS and PFS set up in our engine, we're ready to calculate health state occupancy. In a partitioned survival model, this is really simple. For our PFS health state, we can inform health state occupancy directly from our PFS estimation, which is why we can refer back to column N for this. For patients in the progressed disease health state, we can derive health state occupancy as OS minus PFS. Lastly, we can calculate the proportion of patients who are dead as 1 minus OS. To make sure we've not made any accidental mistakes, we can also add a checksum column, which should always equal 100%. And that's it. We now have a fully functioning partitioned survival model that leverages the extrapolated Kaplan-Meier data from our hypothetical trial, allowing us to apply various survival models to determine health state membership. At this stage, you could also add separate traces for your payoffs, so costs and utilities, but I'm going to make some simplifying assumptions here for this tutorial, which is why I don't need that, but it would be the appropriate way of handling costs and utilities in a PSM. Furthermore, you could create a second engine, just like the one we've just built today, to calculate outcomes for second treatment. All you would need for that is another set of KM curves for PFS and OS to inform health state membership for your comparator. This would allow you to generate comparative cost effectiveness estimates like ICEs and net monetary benefit, but I'll keep it simple for today and stick to just one treatment. Before we start generating our results, let's quickly assign the payoffs for our model. I'm sticking to the bare minimum here, so I'll only add utility values for PFS and PD, as well as costs for those two health states, alongside treatment acquisition cost. You see me add these parameters on the input sheet so that I have everything conveniently stored in one place. With our payoffs in place, let's visualize the results of our partitioned survival model. The best way to do that is by plotting a health state occupancy chart. I'm using a combo chart here as I want both health state occupancy and our original Kaplan-Meier curves to appear in this chart. We can reflect the health state occupancy using the stack area chart type, as we know that all health state membership in each cycle must always add up to 100%. The stacked area chart doesn't work for the KM curves though, so I'll build this element of our visual using a line chart component. After a bit of fiddling around with formatting in Excel, you should have a plot that looks something like this. You can see that the key factor in a partitioned survival model like this one is the survival model we pick for our OS and PFS, as the health state occupancy shifts quite a bit when I switch to a different model. You can also see how our plotted KM data for OS and PFS overlaps with our extrapolated curves, so we know that our model generates plausible results. Another thing that we can observe when selecting models like the log logistic one that predict longer survival, we see how background mortality slowly kicks in, making sure that our estimated survival doesn't conflict with the general population mortality. This becomes especially visible when you look at later model cycles in the engine sheet, where predicted parametric survival is higher than the background mortality adjusted survival. Moving back to our results sheet, let's calculate our payoffs. We start with life years, which we calculate using this formula. Essentially, we're taking the cumulative time spent in the PFS health state, which is measured in months, and converting it to an annual figure by multiplying with our days per month and our days per year multiplier. We just need to do the same thing for PD, and voila, we have our life years. For the discounted life years, we use the same formula, only that this time we're also multiplying with our discounting factor in column H of our model engine. From here, we can easily calculate QALYs by multiplying the life years with the respective PFS and PD utilities. For the costs, I'm making it easy again for myself, as I'm simply assuming that we have annual costs for both PFS and PD, so all we need to do is multiply life years times the respective health state costs. Now, all that's left to do is add graphs for the payoffs, and our PSM is basically complete. Before you start building your own partitioned survival model though, let me briefly mention 3 limitations of this simplified example. First off, we made the assumption that patients remain on treatment as long as they're alive. That's a big assumption. More realistically, we may want to model treatment discontinuation, where patients stop treatment after a certain duration. Secondly, this model currently only leverages the parametric extrapolation. HTA-ready models will usually include a switch in the model that allows you to select a piecewise approach, where the Kaplan-Meier data is used directly and the parametric extrapolation only kicks in when no KM data is available. This preserves the actual observed data and reduces the uncertainty associated with the extrapolation. Third and lastly, we used independent survival models for PFS and OS. Given that PFS and OS are inherently linked, this may not be appropriate. Despite these limitations, I hope that you've been able to see how easy it is to build a partitioned survival model in Excel that is actually not too dissimilar to what you may use in an actual HTA appraisal. If you're looking for an alternative way to build a cost-effectiveness model for an oncology indication, then have a look at the video on screen where I walk you through the process of building a Markov model, and I will see you in the next one.